Good morning. As we come to what's coming up this afternoon, I felt it a little bit fitting that we hear a little bit from Tony Dungy, a man who I greatly respect, also along with a lot of other different coaches throughout not just professional sports, but also through other areas. Guys like Tony Dungy, guys like Bobby Bowden, guys like my dad, guys like my coaches, Christian men who put faith, subtly but put faith first, even in front of victory in whatever sport that was being played. And it's with that, today we're going to speak about another man. Simon Peter is a very interesting character in the Gospels. A lot of times we see Peter, especially in the four Gospels, not portrayed in a very positive light. And this gets even more interesting when we take a look at Luke and Mark and Matthew, where Peter on more than one occasion says something really dumb. Especially when you take into consideration that the writers of these Gospels took their stories from the disciples themselves. And so Peter is giving his accounts to these writers. With that in mind, today I want to turn to Luke chapter 22. Starting in verse 24. Then a dispute also arose among them about who should be considered the greatest. But he said to them, the kings of Gentiles dominate them, and those who have authority over them are called benefactors. But it must not be like that among you. On the contrary, whoever is greatest among you must become like the youngest, and whoever leads like the one serving. For who is greater, the one at the table or the one serving? Isn't it the one at the table? But I am among you as the one who serves. You are the ones who stood by me in my trials. I bestow on you a kingdom, just as my Father bestowed one on me, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Simon, Simon, look out. Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and you, when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Lord, he told him, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. I tell you, Peter, he said, the rooster will not crow today until you deny me 3 times, that you know me. As we begin today, Jesus was preparing his disciples for his eventual death within the next 24 hours. He was having a last meal with them. They were partaking in Passover together, and this was a time where the Jewish people celebrated God's act of leading them out of Egypt, out of slavery, and saving them from servitude. For over 1,000 years, the Jewish people had celebrated this day, not knowing that Passover was really a foreshadowing of the real salvation that God was going to bring. And that's what they were really celebrating this night. Jesus had taken the bread and the cup and told his disciples that this was going to be his last night dining with them on earth. That the bread and the cup represented his sacrifice, and that they were to take it in remembrance of him until he returned. But as he told them this, he also told them one other troubling matter, as we saw last week, and that was the betrayal that was to come. We took a look at Judas last week and how he had agreed to betray Jesus to the teachers of the law for 30 pieces of silver. Judas only cared about himself and what Jesus could do for him. He didn't really care about Jesus. And so when he realized that Jesus was not going to be this humanistic military leader and that he was not going to stand next to him in power with all the money and all the earthly wealth he could desire, he decided to betray him. And so Judas had agreed to look for the opportune time to hand Jesus over to the teachers of the law. But Jesus knows this. Jesus knows exactly what's going to happen, because even though Judas thinks that he's going to betray Jesus that night, that he's going to finally be rid of this, instead, this is all part of the plan. In order for Jesus to be a sacrifice, he needed to be betrayed. In order for this to work, Judas had to happen. And Jesus knew that it was Judas. Jesus knew all along that this was going to come. Jesus knew then about Judas's betrayal. And Judas tells the disciples that he was eating. While he was eating, one of them was going to betray him. He doesn't say who it was, even though Judas was sitting right there at the table. It would seem that it would be the most opportune time to say, hey guys, Judas has just sold us all out. But instead, Jesus doesn't say. He doesn't say who's going to betray him. But he does use it as a teaching point right here. Because this one statement begins a dispute among the disciples. A really dumb dispute, but a dispute nonetheless. The dispute begins over which one of them will betray Jesus. Out of them, nobody wants to be the one who's going to be the betrayer. Judas, by this point, as we see in other passages of Scripture, has already left. He knows. Jesus knows. The rest of them have no idea. They think that Judas has gone out to get more food or more supplies. They had no idea that Judas was actually running to go find that perfect moment to sell them out. But the dispute between the disciples starts out with which one of them is capable of betrayal. But as the dispute continues, it evolves into something different. The dispute then turns into the greatest among them. By starting out with talking about which one of them has the capability of betrayal, it starts becoming statements of, well, I could never do something like that to Jesus. And then evolves to, well, why are you different than the rest of us? Why are you not capable of betrayal? Well, because I'm the greatest disciple. I'm the most loyal. I'm the best disciple out of all of you. They all want to be known as Jesus' greatest disciple. They want to be known as the one who stands with Jesus. And why they think this is so important is because of what they believe about Jesus. They believe, which is rightfully so, that Jesus is the king. But remember, they still have the same mindset, the same beliefs as Judas, that we're still talking about this humanistic, earthly king. And they want to be right next to the next king of Israel. The 11 disciples were left in this room. Every single one of them wants to be at the right hand of the king. But understand that they still have their own motivations behind this as well. They want to be known as the most loyal because of the rewards it will get them. They're still looking at, hey, if we're right next to the king, what's that going to mean for us? For all the glory it will get them. They think that they want to be at the right hand of the king because they want to be the ear behind the throne. They know that Jesus is king. They know that he is the ruler. Ruler of what is the question regardless. They want to be known by people as the greatest disciple. They want to be known as the one that Jesus can actually trust. Influence, control, authority, power. They want to be right next to Jesus at victory. Not that any of us wouldn't want anything different than that. But this is about these disciples saying, look how much better I am than all of you. Each disciple is arguing, trying to make the case of, look how much better I am than the rest of you. We've heard statements like this before, haven't we? But not from the disciples. Where did we hear it from? From the Pharisees. Their attitudes aren't that far off from the people who are trying to kill them. They want to be known as superior. The superior disciple, which is completely contrary to what Jesus has been teaching. So Jesus begins to teach them then by using an example of the very people that they despise. Because right now they're under the rulership, the authority of who? The Romans, the Gentiles. They are under the kingdom, the earthly kingdom of Gentiles who dominate them. The Roman Gentiles have been known as oppressive and dictatorial. They're not benevolent rulers, nor do they pretend to be. The Caesars were not known for their benevolent leadership. And more than often, we see throughout history that the Caesars, the emperors of the Roman Empire, are more known for their insanity than they are for benevolency. Herod at the time was not known for being a benevolent ruler. Yes, we look back and we hear the title of Herod the Great, and yes, he built a lot of mighty buildings, but he built those buildings on the bones of slaves. He was not a benevolent ruler, he was an enforcer. And then they have, as Jesus says, benefactors who have authority over them. You see, every king, every ruler needs what? Money. To be able to do building projects, to be able to do all these different things, build these monuments, you need money. And with money, when people have money to give, they have an ear, they have influence. And so you have these benefactors who are coming behind the kings, and they have a little bit of authority because they control the money. And so these benefactors have authority over even the Jewish people. Who has the ear behind the throne? And this is what Jesus is getting at. Because remember, Jesus is the true king. And what the disciples are wanting is they're wanting to be like the benefactors, who are almost in a sense like this power behind the throne. What Jesus is saying is this is not what leadership should look like. This is what you guys think it should look like, what leadership should look like. That's not what I'm offering. The kings of the Gentiles exercise rulership over them, and the benefactors really have authority over them as well. And they use their authority and their leadership for whom? For themselves. The kings and the benefactors use all of this power and authority not for the greater good of other people, but instead only for themselves. And this is the difference between leadership and tyranny. Because Jesus is about to tell them what leadership should look like and what the greatest really is all about. They need to be like what? Servants. Jesus says, but the greatest among you becomes the youngest, and the leader is the one who serves. Jesus shows the greatest example of leadership throughout his ministry. At every point, he looked out for the greatest good of others. To the point that he comes back in this very event right here, in other passages it shows in this upper room, Jesus did something that the disciples were shocked about. And that is, he knelt down and washed every single one of their feet, including Judas's. The one he knew was going to betray him, who had already betrayed him. And that's where we see what this is really looking like right here. Because washing of feet in those days was the lowest of jobs. It was something that slaves did. And yet we see the king, the God of the universe, doing a job that was low enough that only slaves did it. Jesus is saying if they want to be the greatest, they need to lower themselves. They need to be lower than the greatest. They need to be lower than what they think is greater. Those who are in the greatest amount of leadership must in equal proportion be servants. One of my favorite quotes from a comic book, funny enough, is actually from the comic book Spider-Man. As Kyle sits back there and laughs because he knows which quote is about to come. But it's where Uncle Ben says to Peter Parker, the main character, he says, with great power comes great responsibility. With leadership, true leadership, comes servanthood. Why? Because that is the example set by a loving God. Jesus, who is king, who had every authority, has every power, every riches, everything belongs to him. He is God, the ultimate authority. And yet, he is serving humanity by even being there. Philippians 2 talks about this, where he says, Paul makes the argument to the church in Philippi that the greatest example of unselfishness and the attitude that we should have is one like Christ, who came down in flesh, lowered himself to take the form of a bondservant. Sometimes we minimize that act. We take a look at what Jesus is about to do, but we forget the one greatest point of the ministry of Jesus, the earthly life of Jesus, is actually his birth. God came down in the flesh when he did not have to. God did not have to do anything for us. God is not under any obligation to save anybody. And yet God came down. The king became a servant. And now that king became a servant in order for what? Not just that, but in order to die. He is about to go up to his death for a humanity that had rebelled against him. This ruler, this leader, this king who had been rebelled against is dying for the very people who rebelled against them. And he's doing it for their greatest good. God had every right to wipe everything out and start over. Would have been completely just to do so. And yet here he is about to go to his death, torture, suffering death on a Roman cross as a substitute for the very people who betrayed him. That's leadership. That's being great. Because really, when it comes down to it, all these disciples are arguing about who's the greatest. What a dumb argument. Because the one who is the greatest is standing right in the room with them. Jesus is the greatest. There is no comparison to anybody else. And the greatest himself is saying, if you want to be great, you need to be like me. You need to serve. You need to be a servant. You want to be rewarded? You want to sit on a throne? You want to judge? You want to be a ruler? Be a servant. Be the least in the kingdom. Be the least among you. Don't argue about who is the greatest. Concern yourself with elevating each other. And we say that though, but then enter Simon Peter. Simon Peter doesn't completely get this idea. Granted, Simon Peter doesn't usually completely get it at first. More times than not, Simon Peter has a tendency in the earthly ministry of Jesus while he is learning. Simon Peter has a tendency to say some really dumb things. And here he is speaking up again just like he has before. You've seen in other accounts of this passage, Simon Peter was probably more than likely one of the main instigators of this entire debate. Simon Peter wanted to be the greatest. This is not the first time Simon Peter has had this discussion. Simon Peter wanted to be looked at as the right hand. Granted, Simon was kind of looked at in that way already because Jesus had proclaimed, Simon, on this rock I will build my church. Simon, I call you Peter, Kepha, and on this rock I will build my church. And so Simon was already looked at as kind of a leader among the disciples, the one that Jesus had picked to be leader in his absence. But Peter wants to be the greatest. And Peter is shocked, could not believe that someone would have the audacity. How dare any of you betray Jesus? Why couldn't you people be more like me? I'm the most loyal. I'm the greatest disciple. You guys need to look at my example. He would never do such a thing. And so Simon Peter opens his big mouth once again. He wanted Jesus to see him as the greatest disciple. He wanted all the adoration and the praise of being a good disciple from Jesus. He wanted the adoration of people. Look how great of a disciple that Peter is. How loyal Peter is. He doesn't get it. A lot of times with Peter needs a reality check. He didn't get what Jesus was trying to get at here, and so Peter keeps trying to debate this point, wanting to be the greatest. But here's the other thing we also need to remember. Satan is still prowling around. Satan had already influenced Judas. He took the worst inclinations that Judas had and played on them. He pushed the right button that Judas not only acted on his temptation, but planned it out. Judas made the choice, but Satan definitely had an influence. And Satan was definitely looking around, searching for another disciple that he could try to corrupt. And Peter had gotten arrogant. And Satan wants to influence Simon Peter. He wants to take him down just like he took down Judas. And so we see Jesus says here that he prayed that Simon would not be sifted like wheat. That Satan had asked specifically to sift Peter like wheat. Should take us a little bit back to Job for a second, where Satan comes up to the throne of God and says, Job wouldn't, if you actually made Job suffer, if all this stuff that he had was taken from him, he wouldn't praise you, he'd curse you. Let me take care of Job. And I'll show you, God. I'll show you. Satan has a tendency to want to come up and corrupt, to destroy, to sift the disciples, the faithful, like wheat. But we see Jesus says right here, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Jesus prayed that his faith would not fail so that he could come back and be a help to his brothers, help elevate the other disciples. At the end of the day, they are brothers. They should not be arguing about who is the greatest. They should be helping each other, making each other better, not arguing about something so stupid. Peter should be looking to elevate his brothers, not look better. Do we get the difference? That Peter's sitting there trying to elevate himself instead of looking around the room at his brothers, those whom he claims he loves, and going, how can I help you guys become better? Peter doesn't get it. In his mind, he's still the greatest, and he would never betray Jesus. And he says it here, Lord, I'm ready to go with you, both to prison and to death. It's easy to say when you're not facing that reality. Peter has gotten very arrogant. And he thinks that he's ready for a decision like that. But Jesus knows, Peter, pride goeth before the fall. Peter thinks he's so great, but then Jesus says something shocking. He thinks he is so strong that his faith is unshakable, but Peter's arrogance will only lead to his downfall. And that's when Jesus says something shocking to the man who thinks he's the greatest disciple. He says, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny that you even know me. Not just once, not just twice, 3 times. You think you're so great, Peter. It's going to lead to your failure. And that's where we learn this lesson here today. Pride does goeth before the fall. Arrogance will only lead us to sin and to destruction. We have a tendency sometimes to want to be the quote-unquote greatest. And we see it. We see it all the time. I want to say celebrate, but we're watching football this afternoon, the Super Bowl. And all of these guys, all of them have this motivation to be the greatest. I want to be known as the greatest in every single sport. I want to be the greatest. Something my father taught me years ago. He started rattling off some names that I was unfamiliar with. I sat there and I was like, who are you talking about? And he told me, these are the guys, because I had made a comment about Michael Jordan. Well, I commented at the time as a kid, the greatest basketball player of all time. He rattled off some names, and I went, I have no idea who you're talking about. He goes, those were the Michael Jordans of my time. Nobody remembers who they are. So much for being the greatest. in 20, 30, 40 years, 100 years, will we be able to say who played and who didn't today? Will we be able to sit there and say who even won the Super Bowl today, 40, 50 years, without looking it up? So much for being the greatest. We have a tendency sometimes to have this motivation to want to be the greatest in what we do here, and we forget that we can never measure up. Why? We will never be the greatest. That title only belongs to one, and that's Jesus. That's why this whole argument over who is the greatest with the disciples really is dumb. Because the one who is the greatest, Jesus, gives us an example of how to be. And it's not like the disciples are acting. When you think you're the greatest and you try to get into that arrogant state, I'm the greatest at whatever, fill in the blank. Do you know what it leads to? Being unteachable. Being unteachable. And being unteachable is one of the biggest dangers in a Christian life. Why? Because unteachable people are unaccountable people. And when you are unaccountable, a lack of accountability will always, eventually lead to sin. And sin leads to destruction. Might not be immediate. Peter, unfortunately, found out immediately because it was less than 13 hours later, but he was standing in front of a fire denying Jesus, just like it was told. And Peter went outside the city and wept bitterly, regret, full of sadness, distraught over the fact that all of this stuff he said, all of this stuff, I'm going to go to prison for Jesus, I'm going to go to the death for Jesus, really amounted to what? Nothing. All a bunch of talk. His arrogance only led him to sin and destruction. His pride only led to sin and destruction. He wanted to be the greatest. To this point, all Peter has proven is he's the greatest failure out of all the disciples. Sin will only lead to destruction, and arrogance and unteachability, unaccountability will only lead to destruction. People want to think that they are the greatest today, but it manifests differently. Manifests in a lot of different ways. Really, it's coming from this heart of being selfish. We want what we want. We think we know what's best. We're always right. Those of you who are married know how quickly this dies. But this manifests in so many different ways. In families, it manifests between spouses where both me and Faith have gone through many arguments where I think I'm right and she thinks she's right, and eventually she's right. But my wife and I, we sit there and we come at this thought process. At the end of the day, both me and her are fighting for the same goal. We want to elevate the other. So we think about the statement that Tony Dungy has just made. I am second. Jesus came down and illustrated this. He's God of the universe. Came down and died for humanity who didn't deserve it. Gave us the greatest example of this principle right here. And that is one of elevating each other, doing what is best for each other. If we're coming at it from this attitude, the whole argument of I want to be the greatest goes out the window because you're not concerned about it. All you're concerned about is I want to help everyone else. In the church, people think that their preferences are what is right. And so instead of trying to look at how can I help elevate the people here, your brothers and sisters, all you're looking at is how can I get fed? How can I have what I want in church. I've said it to you before. Church is not about what you want. Church is about God and what you can do for Him. That means helping to elevate the other person even above ourselves. That means we do what is best for all of us, to elevate all of us, not just ourselves. This is what leadership looks like. When we're sitting here leading in committees, when I come up here and teach and preach to you guys, yes, I'm learning too, but this is about all of us together. This is about bringing everybody up and elevating each other. When we are leading in committees, our thought processes should not be, what do I want? Our thought process should be, what's better for everyone else. In the world, people think their way of life is always what's right. In our relationships, people think that only they know, and that's all about them. But deep down, those kind of people are like Peter right here. And arrogance and pride will only come to destruction. Those kind of people eventually will experience downfall. So what do we learn from this? First, we need to be teachable. Everybody, including myself. This is all of us. Something that, if I remember right, I think James asked me in our ordination council. If I remember right, it was you who asked, what am I doing? It was either you or Steve, I can't remember which one. What am I doing to help, as I'm going along, educate, get better, learn more? And there was a few ways I thought of, but it kind of hit me in the head. What am I doing? To not just get better myself, but if I'm not getting better, I certainly can't expect that from all of you. We need to be teachable, not arrogant. We are never at that final goal until we stand at the throne of God. I don't care how old you are. I don't care how much you've already learned. You're not done until you get to that throne. We need to be teachable. And when we are teachable, we put others above ourselves. We don't look to be the greatest. We look to be second. We look for the greatest good from each other, not from just ourselves. We listen. We don't get defensive. We do what is best for everyone. Being arrogant, trying to be the greatest, thinking we're always right, thinking that we are the best disciple since Peter himself, will only lead to destruction. Thinking that we know what's best and nobody else does in the church will only lead to destruction. Thinking that you always know what is right in your marriage will not only lead to destruction, but will probably lead men to getting buried in the backyard. We do what is best for everyone. Why? Because at the end of the day, we love each other. Just like Jesus loved us. And that's what we're getting at here today. We want to elevate each other because we love each other, because Jesus loves us. And Jesus set this example for us. The God of the universe loves us so unselfishly that He came down and did what was the best for all of us. We'll see it here in a couple weeks, one of my favorite passages where Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane and says, what? Lord, Father, if it be possible, take this cup from me, but not my will, but your will be done. Jesus probably was not looking forward to going up on a Roman cross and being beaten and being mocked and spit at and everything. I don't know who would look forward to something like that. Jesus certainly didn't, but He still did it. Why? Because He loved His Father and wanted to obey Him, and because He loved us. So what should we do? We should love each other. And if we truly love each other, we will put others above ourselves. We will never think that we are somehow the greatest. Instead, we will look to lower ourselves in order to elevate other people. Do you love your brothers and sisters enough to drop your pride and go for the best of them. Let's pray. Father God, I pray right now that you will help us to help elevate each other, to look for the best of everyone else, to not get prideful and arrogant and try to become the greatest, but instead know that you are the greatest and you are the greatest example, and that we should follow your example and your lead by helping each other. Help us to follow your example, Lord Jesus, in your name.